Thank you, Kathy, and thank you for that welcome. It's a real honour to be with you. I've had AAPE on a bit of a pedestal, to be honest, rather than a pillar of education, because I think you guys have been in this space a lot longer than me and ahead of the curve in many ways in the system. So just a little bit about me in advanced practice. Some of you, particularly those of you who work in England, will know that I was involved with the Health Education England Centre for Advanced Practice Guidance for Workplace Supervision. And I've provided you there with some links to the document, also to the accompanying films that we created to explain that document. And if you do want to hear me talking about it, there's a link to a little presentation I've made on YouTube there. But those of you who've heard me speak before will be relieved to know that's not what I'm focusing on today. Instead, as Kathy has said, what I'm going to do is talk about how supervision and education can take us into the advanced practice future. So these pillars of practice are a really familiar concept, and we are familiar with them through our different guidance from different parts of the system across the UK and internationally. And so we're familiar with this idea of the education pillar. And what we talk about in that space is our own and others' learning needs and plans across the pillars, becoming self-directed as adult learners, engaging in critical reflection, thinking about where that learning applies at an individual, a service, an organisational and an interprofessional level, empowering health literacy and decision making in the system with our patients and our public, so important role there. Being a role model, an educator, a supervisor and a coach, and instilling confidence in others. So I think we can agree, and I know you will as AAPE, that these are really crucial parts of our practice self. And yet it seems to me that the education pillar is potentially the most neglected pillar of practice. And I wonder why that might be. Sometimes I wonder, are we just setting the bar too high? And is it asking way too much of busy practitioners in already demanding curricula? Or do we need to make more of a play about how education and indeed supervision are the key to navigating inevitable professional and practice uncertainty? And this idea of inevitable practice uncertainty is not a new one, something, as many of you will be familiar with, that Renee Fox spoke about when she talks about training for uncertainty in the medical curriculum back in the 1950s. And it's an idea I've revisited in my own work around supervision too. So this education pillar, and how does supervision fit with that pillar? I think there are some potential tussles. So we might be wondering, is supervision a subset of education? Is education a subset of supervision? Is education more instructional and supervision perhaps more facilitative? Is education sort of more developmental, while supervision is part of governance? And then some of you will be familiar with strands of discussion in the research literature around whether supervision is actually a form of surveillance, and something we sometimes hear from our workforce. This is my team leader snooping on me, checking up on me, making sure that I'm doing what they expect of me. So some challenges and some potential tussles for us to be mindful of in the supervision space. For me, I often think about supervision underpinning the education pillar. It was what really keeps our education components together. And in that regard, perhaps what's more a better analogy is, or a better description is, how there needs to be an intertwining of education and supervision. They're much stronger when they are woven together. And if we return to the pillars of practice, then are we strengthening those pillars by weaving them together with education and supervision? I very often make a case, particularly when I'm looking at curriculum development or curriculum design, making a case for that education pillar being the first pillar of advanced practice, the one we really need to foreground, particularly in our training and development programs. And why do I say that? Well, I think foregrounding that education pillar can prompt the trainee, can prompt the already experienced practitioner who is moving into that advanced level practice space, helps them to identify where advanced level education and supervision knowledge and skills are applicable across their advanced level role and pillar development. What is it that's needed to practice at an advanced level in their practice context, not how to become a replica of another professional, and something that we sometimes slip into in advanced practice. It ensures that there is a focus on the advanced role, how it differs from existing roles. So how does my advanced level role differ from my role as a specialist nurse or an experienced pharmacist, physiotherapist, speech and language therapist, and so on? What existing knowledge and skills will need to be augmented? And I know Kim Manley is joining us today at this conference, and that's a phrase I've sort of borrowed from Kim. She talks about augmenting our knowledge and skills to progress to advanced level capability. I think that's a really helpful way to think about what we're doing when we're developing in advanced practice. And to do that, because we will all have different starting points, it's about us developing an individual learning plan mapped to relevant advanced practice capability frameworks, the one that is relevant in our area of practice. So it's also, I think, important to foreground this pillar because it helps us to decide where and how different capabilities will be developed. So what's going to happen in the classroom, what's going to happen in the lab or simulation, and what's going to be happening in the workplace. It helps us to identify but also challenge some of our taken for granted approaches to learning and development, thinking about these in relation to different learning and supervision theories. And it also then helps us early in our training journey to identify who will be supporting our learning, providing that workplace supervision, verifying the competencies and capabilities. And it also helps us to acknowledge the challenges and the practice uncertainties which accompany the transition to an advanced practice role, and thinking about how to navigate these, anticipating them rather than crashing into them in our training. So I just want to say a little bit about that inevitable uncertainty that's linked with becoming an advanced practitioner. Becoming an advanced practitioner really can be a professional leap of faith. It's a point when we're protecting our hard-won registration. We've spent many years investing on our professional development within our professional and recognised professional roles. So we're really leaping into a new practice context. So we often feel expert and then novice again. So maybe we're nexpert. It's also about how we are focused on keeping the public safe while we're upskilling, and also about being an employee. So the responsibilities that there are for us to remain professionally safe in our practice environments. We know this is a difficult transition, and colleagues, some who may be listening today, have produced some really useful research and synthesis of the research that demonstrate that. So this is not just about in advanced practice. I think advanced practice has sort of lifted the lid on this for the whole of practice, because the attention we're paying to it here is tuning us into how important it is to have this education piece flowing through. But becoming a professional involves integration of knowing, acting, and being in the form of professional ways of being that unfold over time. A really lovely description there by Dal Alba. So it's about our knowledge, it's about our know-how, and it's also about knowing how to be in that role and in that practice setting. This inevitable uncertainty is sometimes regarded as a bit of a marker for risk, and I think probably prior to COVID we'd slightly lost touch with the idea of inevitable uncertainty. We sort of felt if we had the right literature, the right research, we'd always feel more certain in practice. But even when there is a lot of literature and research, in fact, sometimes because of the volume of literature and research, that can contribute to our uncertainty too. So there's something about how we move from regarding uncertainty as a marker for risk, and think about uncertainty as a prompt to learn. And lovely work by Webster Wright, who looked at professional workplace learning with allied health professionals in Australia. She talks about authentic professional learning. And I love this idea. It's when the professional is actively engaged in aspects of professional practice they care about, perceive is uncertain, and see as novel. So if we can learn from our uncertainties in practice, then I would argue we potentially have a better chance of mitigating risk. I like to think about supervision as a place of sanctuary and meta-practice, and this is what I heard in my own research with allied health professions about supervision. It was a safe place to share and explore and resolve uncertainties, with a focus on maintaining and promoting professional and public safety through continuous professional learning. So when I say meta-practice, what I'm talking about is it's a practice about practice. It's where we can work out what our learning needs are by examining our uncertainties, not about judging the other professional, but focusing on those uncertainties. And if you want to read a little bit more about my thinking here, then do visit my blog, thepermeablepractitioner.com. Some of you will have seen me use these slides before, but I think they're great quotes and they really underline why we need these safe spaces to share uncertainty and learn. And they're crucial because, as Björk Bettmo says, being a professional is a movement back and forth between supporting and letting oneself be supported, between confronting and being confronted, between pushing and being pushed. And also because as practitioners, we might be cognitively very aware that we might need to behave differently in practice, and yet remain determined not to do so in practice. And that's something Reg Revens, the person behind Action Learning, draws our attention to. And returning again to Dal Alba, who tells us about how we need to guard against decay in our knowledge and skills, and the fact that some of those things will go out of date. We might not have used them for a while. We saw this again in COVID when people were redeployed to areas where they had once felt really expert and now felt more novice again. So guarding against decay and professional tendencies to turn to off-the-peg solutions. And that's something I think we really do need to use supervision to challenge ourselves, to look at some of our taken for granted practices and examine how well they are serving us and our public. Also, because as Mabon and Cornwall and Sweeney have described, really relating to patients takes courage, humility and compassion. It requires constant renewal by practitioners and recognition, reinforcement and support from colleagues and managers. So I think those ideas from the literature show us how supervision is pretty fundamental for professional and public safety, and supervision provides us with that space in practice to engage in important learning. From my own research, I've noticed these really helpful behaviours that support us to resolve our uncertainties through learning, and as a cluster I refer to them as practitioner permeability. And those things are being self-aware, having an awareness of and for others, not keeping that awareness of uncertainties to ourselves but sharing them, being feedback seeking and willing to hear probably feedback that sometimes we don't always agree with, or we're hoping might have been more in line with our own thinking, but engaging in that feedback seeking orientation, being open to alternatives, applying critical agency and awareness to those alternatives, working out which ones will work for us, but ultimately remaining willing to change, so maintaining a learning disposition. And these are important behaviours and characteristics for supervisees or trainees and learners, but also important characteristics and behaviours for supervisors and educators. Let me elaborate a little on that. So for the supervisee, the trainee and the learner, being permeable is about recognising our own uncertainties and the implications of those for practice and safety. So maintaining myself as a safe professional, staying safe professionally, maintaining my registration, not putting that at risk, but also keeping an eye on public safety. What are the implications for the patients I'm working with? Sharing those uncertainties with others, for example, through supervision. Feedback seeking, welcoming that feedback, and exploring other ways of learning and doing that I might not have considered. Weighing up what works and, importantly, what's safe. And then ultimately being willing to implement some of those changes and thoughts and ideas in my practice as I develop. For the supervisor or the educator, self-awareness is about recognizing your own position and experience. You're in a position potentially of power. There may be a hierarchy, a professional, socio-professional hierarchy. You're more experienced in most cases than your supervisee in the area that you're supervising. And you need to use that thoughtfully for the learner with an eye on the benefit for that learner. So knowing when to give them a little bit of space to grow and experiment and test their ideas, but also with an eye on public safety, knowing when to step in. You'll be willing to share your concerns about that supervisee's practice with them, but also, really importantly, celebrate successes with that individual too. And how can we build on those? How can we have more of what's working well? What can we learn from the areas of your practice where you feel more secure and more certain that will help us to navigate the uncertainties and the areas where you feel less confident? Welcoming feedback about yourself as a supervisor or an educator. I don't know that we necessarily do that enough. Exploring other ways of learning and doing, recognizing how your supervisee does something is not an exact replica of how you do it, but it's clinically justified and safe. So we're not there to make a mini version of ourselves as supervisors. Weighing up what is workable and safe, and continuing to engage in our own professional development, including in our own education pillar. So I would say that developing these permeable behaviours and characteristics, and I describe them as behaviours and characteristics, not sort of they're not something that kind of you're born with. These are definitely things we can develop and we can hone and make better. And I should say, being a permeable practitioner, I can spot it in other people. It doesn't always mean that I'm able to always be permeable myself. It's something you have to continue to work at. So I do think those are the sorts of behaviours and characteristics we should be encouraging and developing through our education pillar development. And yet, educator and supervisor development tend to have pretty limited career development currency, and they're not generally seen, or developing in those aspects of practice are not necessarily seen as career development priorities, either for individuals or for employers. When we look at what tends to be preferred or our preferences for continuing professional development, I know from having been a service leader myself in my NHS days, generally people ask for more clinical learning, more clinical development, more clinical training, sometimes a bit of leadership, sometimes a bit of research, seldom anything to do with education. And many practitioners I speak to about workplace education and supervision have seldom attended any specific training or development that's focused on this pillar. They tend to pick up their skills more vicariously, adopting a what works for me approach, or avoiding the toxic examples that they've replicating those toxic examples that they've come into contact with. And they're largely unaware of models or frameworks and have never read any literature or research in the field. And I want to suggest to you that that would be pretty unthinkable for clinical competence and capability. And yet, if we look at our registration, whether that's the HCP or the NMC or the General Pharmaceutical Council and so on, we see that our registration requires sign-up to the standards of proficiency, which refer to the need for practitioners to do things like understand the importance of participation in training, supervision and mentoring, demonstrate effective supervision, teaching and performance appraisal, contribute to the education, training and development of the team or others. So we've got a real paradox going on here. If our registration, and when we're signing our re-registration declaration, we're saying we're meeting our standards, and yet we're not engaging in this pillar so actively. So are we setting the bar too high? Is it asking too much of busy practitioners? Or is the education pillar simply forgotten? I think there's some encouraging news, and we're pushing at an open door. And I just wanted to share this quote that I had from an email after a module completed just recently, where this MSK physio says, "I just wanted to say thank you for delivering the supervision and education module. I found it extremely thought-provoking, and it's really stoked my interest in the pillar of ACP. Over the past couple of years, I feel I've had a conscious incompetence in relation to education and supervision practices, and have just been muddling through with what I thought might have been the right thing to do. And so I cannot thank you and the module enough for guiding the way and showing me the academic light. The module's given me so many ideas and sparks for projects within our department that will hopefully embed and promote education and supervision within our practice." And that nudged me to think, how are advancing practitioners using this education pillar? So not a nice piece of research here yet, but insights from the first 100 students who've completed the module that I run. Mostly nurses, some physiotherapists and paramedics, and a few pharmacists, occupational therapists, radiographers, operating department practitioners and dietitians, from across lots of different parts of the practice system. So what do I notice in their assignments, and how are they applying the education pillar? So these, I would say, are the themes. They're reviewing, renewing and enhancing taken for granted workplace learning and supervision practices. They're adopting more learner and practitioner-centred approaches. They're linking uncertainty, supervision and learning with professional and public safety, be it governance, standards and risk management and beyond. They're applying theory and models to provide frameworks for more effective workplace learning and supervision. They're applying theory and models to learn with, from and for patients, and they're linking ongoing professional development and supervision with patient experience and quality, which is so exciting. They're grasping their role as an advanced practitioner and an educator. So they're leading workplace education and supervision initiatives and projects. They're influencing cultural change and work around workplace supervision and learning. They're being a learning educator supervision role model and enthusing others in advanced practice and beyond. They're sharing relevant education and supervision research and literature. They're modelling learner and practitioner behaviours, and they're being open about their own uncertainties and demonstrating an ongoing commitment to professional development. So specifically, what are they doing? I see assignments that redesign simulation learning sessions, for example, in the emergency department, thinking about different learning preferences and approaches and being practitioner-centred. They're rethinking skills development, so be it history taking, endoscopy, the management of eye injuries, management of closed distal radial fractures, pressure care assessments in the community, humanising interactions with patients. They're using theories and models to support the redeployment of the workforce during the first wave of COVID. They're exploring their own role as an advanced level educator and supervisor to support beyond advanced practice, so supporting less experienced colleagues and students from all professions. They're exploring options to spot and support the trainee in difficulty. They're designing workplace learning for emergency department colleagues to enhance patient-centred care for people with mental health crisis. They're examining incident and complaints data. This is great. Incident and complaints data to identify workplace learning and supervision priorities. And they're drawing on their own reflections of a clinical incident to shape future learning and for the self and team. They're thinking about different approaches to medicine management and how different colleagues might need different approaches in primary care. They're thinking about how to ensure colleagues can raise equality, diversity and inclusion uncertainties in supervision. They're encouraging collaborative learning to support the transition to advanced practitioner, drawing on action learning and for peer support, and drawing on action learning for workplace educator and supervisor continuing professional development. Couple more, rethinking patient education, so be it intermittent self-catheterization, pain management, antibiotic use, redesigning appraisal to ensure learning and development focus, and so on. So I do think we are pressing on a door that is ajar here. Even from the people who are filling the gaps in their portfolio, I'm hearing that people feel that engaging in the education pillar completely changes their approach to delivering education, being aware that their approach was outdated, but not having the theories and tools to change that, and not having learned anything like this before, and knowing that that's influenced their practice. So I think there are signs that supervision and education is supporting the journey into the advanced practice future. I think there's something for us to cheer, but there's lots still to do. Keep being great advanced practice educators and education pillar advocates. Absolutely celebrate that you are starting to be heard and the value of the education pillar is starting to be recognised and embraced in practice. And I think that's me done. If you would like to pose any questions or comments or observations.